Today we are here in Chicago at AELL's headquarters, speaking with Judith Margaret Wright, who served as Associate Dean for Library and Information Service at the University of Chicago's D'Angelo Law Library from 1980 until her retirement in June of 2013. Judith, let's talk a little bit about, we'll begin by talking a little bit about your life, both when you were young and perhaps today.
Well, I grew up on a family farm in West Tennessee. My grandfather was a farmer, and all four of his daughters built their houses on our farm. And I was surrounded by my cousins and had a really quite ideal childhood growing up. And then I moved to Chicago to go to the Graduate Library School at the University of Chicago in 1969, and I've never left.
So you're sort of a Chicagoan now, tried and true.
I am.
Yeah.
I raised my children here, and
it's been
I've never
fairly
left.
cold the last few days. And,
Horrible. Yes.
I'm used to the more balmy Pacific Northwest by
Yes.
comparison.
I think it would be really miserable for you. We can console ourselves when it drops down into the 20s and teens that there'll be days in January when we walk out the door and it's 15 or 20 degrees and we go, oh my goodness, finally warm again.
Mm-hmm.
But not yet. It feels
Well,
cold.
I usually travel when I come to this part of the country at a more benign time of the year. But
Much more sensible.
was actually, it worked out for us. So it's fun to be here and talking with you and some of our other colleagues that we've been talking to the last couple of days. Yeah. Speaking of things, you mentioned that you have a degree. Could you talk a little bit more about your formal education and where you got the degrees?
Well, I went to what is now the University of Memphis to college, which was in the big city of Memphis. It was quite exciting when I did that. And then after I did a few other things, I came to Chicago and went to the University of Chicago Graduate Library School. And then later went to DePaul University Law School and finished my law degree.
Well, I know when you started out, you started at the University of Chicago as a documents librarian. And the librarian there at the time was one of the people that I remember, was very highly regarded in the field, Leon Liddell. You must have worked a bit with him. Could you talk a little bit about him, perhaps?
Leon Liddell was a wonderful Southern gentleman and a fabulous librarian. When I had always thought I wanted to be a librarian, and when I graduated from college, I actually had an undergraduate minor so I could be a school librarian. But my first job as a school librarian was extremely boring, and I abandoned libraries. And I went to work for the Red Cross, and I spent a year in Vietnam. And while I was there, I worked with a group of really interesting women, and many of them had master's degrees in various liberal arts subjects. And they persuaded me that I did not want to follow that path, and that I should reconsider libraries. So when I came back home, that's what I did. And in my last quarter of library school, Leon Liddell was teaching the law libraries course in the library school. And I just loved the course. And at the conclusion of the course, he offered me a job. That was back when you could offer someone a job.
Yes, I remember those days and how changed it is now.
Yes. And I knew within the first week of working there that I had found my life's work, that this is what I really wanted to do. It was also wonderful because Judy Gaskell, who just retired a year or so ago as the Supreme Court librarian, also started the same month I did. And we worked together for many years. I not only found my career, I also found a lifelong friend. And after we'd both been working there a few years, we realized that if we're going to stay in academic law libraries, we should go to law school. So we went off to DePaul to the part-time program, and another law librarian colleague, Donna Tukey, was also one of our classmates. And the three of us went all the way through night law school together, in and out days sometimes. Don and I would ride the Clark Street bus home every night, and Judy would take the train home. We used to meet for dinner before classes, and then go to the library after class. And I can't believe we ever did it, but we did. When we finished law school, I almost immediately was offered the job as the director of the law library. And Judy agreed to come back with me as head of public services. So we started the next step in our careers together. We were quite lucky. It was a wonderful time to be a law librarian.
I've heard a number of our current colleagues, especially some of the younger ones, that mentioned that, boy, when you were acting, our generation, it was so much nicer. It was sort of the so-called golden era for law libraries compared to today's more, shall we say, difficult times.
I think it was better then.
Yeah.
It was better. Easier, I should
Mhm.
say.
Well, speaking of some of the things you were able to accomplish, you were actually the director. I mean, you started off as documents and also did reference at the university law library, but then you became the director, and you were director for roughly 33 years.
33
which
years.
is a pretty good
Mhm.
tenure.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about some of the things you did and accomplished?
Well, it was, there were great challenges facing law librarians then, but there were really three main challenges during my career. The first was managing old, large collections.
Mhm.
And for my generation, we had to continually face the challenge of space for collections. And we were lucky at Chicago because it was a fairly small law school, so we didn't have to have a lot of duplication. But even so, we were always acquiring. I spent my career moving books in and out of storage, moving them, did 2 building renovations, installed compact shelving, and then the final thing we did, which was quite wonderful, is the university built a high-density storage facility on campus. And we moved, and Sherry Lewis was the one who primarily did this, moved 300,000 volumes into this high-density storage facility, transferred them over there, and consolidated our collection so that we were able to retain in the building what we consider a really useful collection. We got all of those earlier editions of everything off the shelf. They're all in the storage. Maintaining this collection is still a bit of a challenge to always make sure the current editions are the ones in the building. But it was an overwhelming, continuing process during most of my career, managing these print collections. And the second piece of managing those collections was retrospective conversion, which younger librarians had never even heard of, at least not in context of bibliographic records. But coming up with the funds to create those machine-readable records, whoever uses that word anymore, was overwhelming. I spent years trying to get funds for it, getting the projects done. Lorna Tang is head of technical services, and I could say Lorna pretty much devoted her career to that. But we were finally able to do it. And then the third great challenge of my generation of librarians and yours was the transition to electronic information. And that, of course, is a continuing challenge, although a very exciting one for the current generations of librarians. It's just amazing. And almost every day there's something new. There's both new content, new interfaces, new search strategies that are just, you can't even begin to imagine what will be the next step, right?
It's a wonderful world with some of the things we can do, but boy, we've become dependent on them too.
Oh yes, totally.
Sort of on the side, I live in an area of Olympia, Washington, and we had an ice storm a couple of winters ago, and the power was knocked out for 5 days in my house. Now, I have a generator, so the heat and the light work just fine, but after 7 or 8 hours, the cable system's backup batteries all were depleted, so that went down, and that was my internet access. And I hadn't realized until I was 4 days without the internet how dependent I am on it. I mean, when I do almost any research, it's on my screen in my den, or even listening to the radio station in the morning. I had to go find one of the old portable radios, and then I had to find a station that I could both tune in and could tolerate.
Yep.
Because I listen to this a station from San Francisco that I like normally by streaming over the internet.
We're it's probably a real vulnerability that we're refusing to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, now you were at a time when we started off and everyone was building print collections, and then there was a period of time when many of schools and other libraries started to use microfilms and so on. And it's my understanding that you were able to kind of resist getting really involved in too much of that, because you had, as you mentioned, the facilities and then the storage facility to house hard copy.
Yes. Now, I have to admit, there's really two sides to that. The positive side was that we had the print collections and didn't need to buy the microform collections. We had it in print.
Yes.
So we didn't. I mean, Jerry DuPont, who I think is fabulous, actually did a list of the law libraries in the country, microform holdings. You know, he pulled it out of the ABA stats. And there was only one other school that had fewer microform holdings than the University of Chicago in the entire country. That was good for us because we don't have to worry about what to do about that microform. We were free riding on the schools that have bought it. We have to make sure that LLMC will hold on to their film, but we have to make sure that some of those schools that bought this film hold on to it too. And I actually think that's something that we should be a little bit more organized about because they're going to be tempted to get rid of it. It's heavy, it's hard to manage. No one uses it. It's all available in electronic form, or most of it. So that's a separate issue. But it meant we were able to free ride on other schools. And then when LLMC became digital, we were free riding on that too because we had not. That's how they got the money from all the microforms they managed to sell. So it was an advantage for us in many ways, and but we were not contributing to what was a larger effort that resulted in both preservation of the print in microform and the ability to create the digital versions now that they're doing.
But you were actually helping to protect those of us that didn't have paper or had to read the paper by retaining the books.
Yes, and we can honestly say that because the University of Chicago, the university was committed to this high-density storage facility, that I think University of Chicago will probably be one of the very few academic law libraries in the country that actually will be able to indefinitely and permanently, as permanently as anything, hold on to their print collections. Because I think most schools are going to be under more and more pressure, and that most deans are not going to be willing to store all books. So the few places that are able to keep them, and there are very few, I believe, will be able to do that for the rest of us. So I think that is very valuable. I encourage libraries as they withdraw print to check with Chicago and make sure we have it. I don't think there'll be much. Well, there's a lot, of course, but I think it's not our problem yet, but our colleagues in the future need to be very cautious about making sure that the print's retained somewhere.
Now, you've mentioned Jerry DuPont of the Law Library Microform Consortium. We talked to him a few months ago for the same oral history. And he mentioned some of the things that they are still doing. For example, they are mostly doing digital materials now. But he gets the original paper books, and then after they have digitalized them, they take the books and they send them to sort of a permanent storage in salt mines, actually. And we asked him, well, why do that with the digital? And he said, well, maybe he doesn't need to, but if they find out later that for some reason we need access to those originals, maybe technology changes too fast or something happens to the database, to have those books, it just makes him a lot more at ease, shall we say, with himself.
Right, which is a wonderful project. Now, of course, that will only be, I believe, within the content that's in LLMC digital, and they don't usually include anything that's in copyright. So we have to hope that LLMC digital will survive and thrive for 50 to 100 years, so that as long as print is produced, they'll be around long enough to include things as they fall out of copyright, which is a big hope.
A lot of that, I'm sure, had to do with Jerry and his initiative and abilities.
Amazing what's been done.
Hopefully he'll have successors who will carry it forward.
Well, so far Kathleen, it seems to be as knowledgeable and committed as he is. Well, as committed, no one's as knowledgeable as Jerry.
Well, Judith, you're one of those sort of quiet people that we all recognize as a very accomplished colleague. In fact, you've been described as a librarian's librarian by people who I think are librarians. So if they're describing you that way, that's
a compliment.
Top compliment. I also remember that when you were nominated for the AELL Hall of Fame, I don't know how much you know about who nominates you and so on. I don't know how public this is all supposed to be, but one of the people that wrote on your behalf was Blair Kaufman, who was your colleague for a while here in the suburbs of Chicago at Ohio Northern, and then later at the University of Wisconsin, which is literally up the road not too far to the north. and now, of course, has been at Yale for quite a few years. And he described you as, and I'm going to read it, the one who people listen to and respect. He also mentioned that you were part of the Gang of 10, so-called Gang of 10, which are the heads of the 10 probably largest academic law libraries in the country, and that you get together. So you've been active with your colleagues at that level, as well as your colleagues in other parts of the profession. You want to talk a little bit about some of your the work you've done sort of outside of your day job?
Well, the gang was a group started by Morris Cohen
Mm-hmm.
when he was at Yale, or was it Harvard? It was Harvard.
Okay.
And it was an effort to, our deans met regularly,
Mhm.
and he thought that the law librarians should be doing the same. And the group has expanded somewhat and continued over the years to generally meet twice a year at AELL and AELS. It's a very useful meeting because we could sort of keep up with what we were doing.
Mhm.
And then later, more recently, there have been several longer meetings, including a larger group of people, some very serious efforts to work on digital information and especially to encourage law schools to produce digital journals. And then some efforts to coordinate some foreign law issues. And one of the things I learned from that group, I found our meetings were always very useful, but what I learned from that group was pretty obvious, is that if you want to get something done, you need staff. And volunteer librarians trying to squeeze it into the extra minutes they have will not get you far.
Mhm.
So it's been a very useful information exchange group, and I've enjoyed it for that reason. But I think that as far as accomplishing anything, some of the other work I did, we probably accomplished a little bit more. The ABA Law Libraries Committee,
Mhm.
and then the ABA Law Library of Congress Committee I was on. And I'm sure this committee doesn't exist anymore. I enjoyed those. I'm not sure how much we accomplished. My early work with LIPA.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I've been working with LLNC the last few years, and I think they're one of the most forward-looking and most important organizations that law librarians have, and that we probably need to do, as far as preservation is concerned, that's the group we need to be working with.
Mhm. And you know, it's interesting. You talked earlier about some of the things you did here at the university, including the conversion of
Mhm.
older style cataloging, which for our newer colleagues meant that it was on cards and
Mhm.
a card drawer called a card catalog, and you know, there was usually one such card catalog in the place, and people had to actually physically go to it to look things up
Mhm.
and then get the call number and go to the shelf. And with the online catalogs started to come in, I mean, it just opened up all sorts of a huge world, and people started
Yeah.
using them, and of course the newer stuff would go directly to the online catalog. But the challenges that directors faced in getting the support needed, especially with very large collections that were cataloged in the traditional
Mhm.
or older style, getting that information into the online catalog. You've already alluded to that. And that was always a challenge for all of us. It took us some years at American U, where I was director. We finally got the old catalog, and the cataloger came to me one day and said, "Pat, you can get rid of it now." And I didn't think she'd ever let me get rid of it ever, but she
Yeah.
was so pleased that they'd finally finished the conversion that she wanted to get rid of the relics so that she wouldn't.
But of course, the next morning, we realized the next step, that we had to link from that card catalog, or now the online catalog, to the online sources when we had them.
Mhm.
You remember that?
Oh, I remember that.
Linking
Storage,
individually
yeah.
title by title, and then finally managing to do these loads that would link the bibliographic records, and
Yeah.
trying to make sure they worked, the proxy servers. I think that stuff works much more smoothly, but the first few years there were pretty rough and very labor intensive.
Well, getting into the so-called digital era has not been one without a few bumps in the road, so to speak.
No, and I'm sure there'll be more, right?
Yeah, I'm sure there probably will be too.
Probably some we can't even anticipate. There may be some more issues in the future with libraries having access to material at all as more and more publishers try to sell directly to the end user. That would probably be an issue for our colleagues in the future.
You know, I read years ago that when Gutenberg developed his press that used movable type, and they could suddenly print books as opposed to having the monks or whoever handwrite them all, it created what ultimately was allowed the building up of the university system as it existed primarily in Western Europe and eventually in this hemisphere. Now with digitalization and online, the potential is that anyone, any place on earth can have access to the sorts of resources that one would say come here to Chicago or go to the Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the Library of Congress or the British Museum or wherever to acquire, or maybe to several of those places really.
That's right.
We're not probably quite there yet, but the potential is there.
But there's always challenges. Right now, one of the big challenges are the various devices people use and making sure they can use the information sources that we provide, the libraries provide, with their, whenever and however they want to use them, right?
That's right. And the devices change. I mean, how could we live without smartphones? You know,
Exactly.
we didn't have those 5 years ago.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Another area that you know you took quite the lead in was recognizing early on that American legal scholars, even American legal practitioners, had to be able to get access to foreign law more and more, because as the world was moving in the direction of, you know, transnational this, that, and the other thing, it became important. So you did a lot of early work in sort of helping to bring us all along into thinking that this was an important area and one that libraries should be addressing.
Well, I don't think I get much credit for that. I was driven by self-interest. Adolf Sprudes, who had been our foreign and international law librarian, retired, and when he retired, I realized that, and you will remember this, the foreign and international law librarians, for the most part, were a World War II refugee generation.
That's right.
And they were focused, for the most part, they were in the major research libraries. And I began to be very concerned because we had to hire somebody to replace Dolph. And that's when I got involved in this effort and organized the town meeting at the AALL meeting in, I think, what, 91?
91,
Yeah.
yes.
And I actually think that is an example of a successful ground roots effort that really had lasting consequences, because I think the librarians who participated in that, the foreign and international law librarians, they then used that as a starting point, and they themselves are quite well organized, and over the last 20 years have really organized themselves as far as programming is concerned and cooperative efforts are concerned. And so I've had nothing to do with it. They have really, you know, they are a group of people who love to share knowledge. And I also did not anticipate, so I was sort of fortunate that their efforts have been coming along because I'm expanding, because interest in international law in particular, foreign and comparative law a little bit less so, has just grown in this world that we're living in. You know, there's much more interest in international law now, and to a lesser extent foreign law, than there was in the early 90s. It's amazing how many libraries, how many law schools are now much more interested in it. And of course, because of online information sources, there are so many resources available to libraries to provide to their user group that they couldn't in the old days. So I think I don't really get any credit for that. I think it had some, we have the Chicago Legal Academic System, which actually was created many years ago by George Grossman and Randy Peterson, and I came in right at the beginning of it for the local academic law library directors. And over the years, that's been a quite successful, I think, example of local cooperation, even though we're all right here in the same city. It's so hard for us to find time to get together, exchange ideas, exchange information. But we have managed to do it over the years and find it quite useful, and our various interest groups amongst our staffs have done some of that too. So that also allowed us to try to formally cooperate a little bit with foreign law collections. Both Northwestern and Chicago have still got pretty extensive collections in foreign law.
Well, you are sort of a unique city in that you have two, you know, considered to be top tier academic law libraries. University of Chicago and Northwestern. In Washington, D.C., we had, of course, the Library of Congress, and of course it was very convenient for the people running the universities above us to say, well, we have that, so we don't need to have it in our own place.
Exactly. You can continue to rely on them, right?
Yeah, that was very prevalent for a long time. Georgetown finally broke away from that mold, but it took Bob Oakley, I think, as librarian there to convince them that the error of their earlier ways.
Well, and the Law Library of Congress is, they don't really have the funding to buy a lot.
No.
So it's amazing what they managed to do.
Yeah. Well, you know, you allude to the fact that you maybe haven't been given an awful lot of recognition in the sense that of what you've done with the international, and yet, you know, the record is clear. You did a lot, and you helped us all an awful lot. I can remember when I first came as director to American U in Washington 40 years ago now, we had a dean who was very interested in international law, so we were building that collection somewhat from the beginning. It was still pretty early on. One time, you know, budgets can get a little tight, and I had to do a little trimming, and I cut a service that I know hadn't been gotten any use from students or faculty in a field that was tax. And the tax teacher came to me just roaring mad when she finally, months later, discovered, demanded to know why I was spending money on international law instead of tax. And that was part of what we are all facing. You must have encountered it occasionally, because there's never quite enough.
There's never quite enough money. And collections are, well, we won't get into collection development issues, right? But there's never enough money to buy everything you want. We were fortunate in that we were able to rely on a university library that bought a lot. They didn't buy any law, but when we got into the sort of associated fields, and of course that's a challenge facing the future law librarians, the fact that all of our law schools are now hiring so many faculty with JD, PhDs who do a different type of research and need materials that are not traditionally part of the law collections. That will be a future challenge.
Well, challenges as they are, is now, since you and I are both retired, we can watch and
see how they sort them out,
do
right?
it, but it'll be fun to keep sort of an eye on what's going on, I think, in its own way. Earlier I mentioned, I mean, we've talked about the fact that in some ways you may not have been supposedly recognized fully for some of what you did.
No, I think I've been more than I.
Well, that's what I'm going to clarify now. You have. I've already mentioned that you're part of ALL's Hall of Fame. And it's a fairly small group by itself of
very esteemed colleagues, right?
Makers and the shakers of the various eras. The association and the profession have been so active. But you're also the recipient of the Frederick Charles Hicks Award from the academic special interest section, and for your contributions to academic law librarianship, and the recipient of the Chicago Association of Law Libraries highest award as well for all the contributions. So, you know, in terms of recognition, it's there in all the really formal senses with those awards. And, you want to comment about, you know, some of your professional involvement that beyond perhaps what we've talked about that might have helped you to, shall we say, be recognized for all that you've done?
Well, I think I've mentioned a lot of it. One thing I haven't mentioned at all was that for a number of years, maybe almost 20, I was able to teach the law libraries course at the Graduate Library School of the University of Chicago until they closed that program. So I actually have educated a lot of librarians, law librarians, but many of them, of course, are in firms, which is interesting, I think, right? But I greatly enjoyed doing that. It would be, I don't see how, well, I shouldn't say this because I'm sure many are doing it. I think it would be difficult for anyone who's a director to teach that course these days, because I think it would be really difficult for any director to remain as current with information resources as you need to be to teach that kind of course, or to teach almost any legal bibliography course anymore. You've got to work the records desk all the time to keep up with it. so that everything new that comes out, I mean, it's just daily changes in databases, new interfaces, new libraries being pulled out. It's just an incredibly complex world in which you must have to build on a lot of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I did enjoy doing it while I did it.
Mm-hmm.
And most recently, well, I wasted my time for a number of years, like 8, working with the ABA Law Libraries Committee, trying to come up with ways for libraries to measure or assess our collections and services.
That's right.
That effort was a complete failure.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, it's such needed work,
It
too,
is,
'cause
it is.
the way they've been doing it is so somewhat illegitimate.
And we need to be able to, they need to be able to demonstrate the value of the library in
Mhm.
valid ways that, and perhaps one of the problems with what we were doing is it was perceived as ways of law libraries to show their value vis-a-vis other law libraries. And the focus needs to be on showing the value of the library for the mission of the law school.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still not giving up on that. The ABA is, of course, changing their procedures and their assessment activities a great deal. I think it's a new future. A new future. That's I don't think quite a way to put it. There's a new possibility to do more in this area, but it's going to take a different view. So I won't be involved in it, thank goodness. But I do hope our colleagues will not give up on that effort. There must be ways, especially there was a lot of talk just a few years ago, and then the economic crisis sort of drove it away, about how coming up with ways of measurement, the law school programs, and how they could assess the value of their education. And of course, the classic measure for law schools is bar passage rates, but there were a lot of efforts to come up with some new ways of measurement. Some schools were quite involved in it. Once things settle down a bit financially with law schools, which will take a while, those efforts might come up again. So I think that could still be interesting to do that.
Well, there remains work to be done,
Mhm.
and with all the changes coming, the ways that even such as they were, that we
Mhm.
measured quantity and quality
Mhm.
sort of in one fell figure, like a book count,
Right.
are no longer quite valid, nor used anymore for
No.
for many purposes. Because with the digital stuff, basically it's all there. If you get the subscription and maintain
Right.
them.
Yes, and one of the ways that the Association of Research Libraries have moved is for just what you spend. That's not a valid way anyway, and I think the ABA is moving away from those kinds of measures. So it'll be a challenge in the future for somebody to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah. Now, I know this was not something we talked about before, as we got ready for this conversation today, but sort of in keeping in mind some of the recognition that has been, I think, most appropriately accorded to you for all that you've done. Your successor, Sherry Lewis, who's also had a conversation for the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project earlier this week, mentioned that the University of Chicago is naming a fellowship in your honor. And I, was somebody who would have loved some sort of formal recognition after the fact when I retired.
It was quite wonderful.
This has got to be a nice opportunity.
It's wonderful, and I think it will give the law library a great deal of flexibility in the future, and it will really be a way to enhance learning opportunities for future law librarians. I think it'll be a great program.
Mhm.
And Sherry has the imagination and vision to make sure that it's a really good program.
Well, she had a good mentor, I understand. She was your assistant for quite a while.
Yes.
Yeah.
I greatly enjoyed working with her. And then the associate law librarian for technical services is Lorna Tang, and she's a real expert. So between the two of them.
Getting the right people in place does make life easier for those at the top in its own way.
Whoa, the best thing about our jobs is that we get all the credit for all the work other people do.
Mhm.
It's quite unfair, but boy.
The way it is. Well, keep in mind the flip side. If
That's
somebody
true.
screws up, we get the credit for
Right,
that too.
you get to dance pretty fast.
Absolutely. Well, as we're sort of nearing the end of our conversation this afternoon, Judith, it's customary to ask if there's anything that we have not talked about that you would like to mention, or something we have that you would like to expand on.
The last few years, I did a couple of AELS panels about the futures of law libraries. And it was interesting because the last one I did, I think, was in 2010 or 11.
Mm-hmm.
And it was before the most recent crisis in law schools. And as we know, many schools right now are having major financial issues.
Very much.
And it's going to, I think, in those talks, I think I had like 20 future trends. And what I predicted in that talk is going to come true much faster because of this financial crisis. And I think the future of law libraries is really going to be, you're going to have to be very nimble, very quick, and become very adept at figuring out, and we can help each other with this, they can help each other, because we need to figure out ways to enhance our value within our own institutions, and that has nothing to do with what other schools are doing. It's just that you can use any good ideas that anybody's got to help do that. And one of the things that's changed very quickly, and maybe just because of time, because you mentioned it earlier, so the golden age of academic law libraries. And I think my generation, our generation, probably had a hard time really understanding how dramatic those changes were, and how dramatically law libraries must change. That the issues of great importance to our generation will not be so important in the future. And it's not just print collections, but all these issues of job security, which may change in other fields too. But it's still going to be a fun career. It won't, perhaps, it's not going to be, I hate to say it, but it's probably not going to be as great as it was for us. But one of our graduates mentioned this years ago, that quality is a moving target. And all throughout my career, the challenge and the fun has always been that as soon as you finished one totally essential project, there was another. You always had a new goal, and future librarians are going to have exactly the same situation. Their goals will be different, but I think they'll be equally challenging, equally fun. So in a sense, I'm sorry I'm going to miss it. But on the other hand, I am definitely the prior generation.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, looking back to those who were the generation before us, they had changes during their time. The libraries got larger in terms of volumes, but they were all volumes in book form, pretty much. A lot of them were not cataloged or organized in any really systematic way when they began, and that was part of what that generation brought. And so we inherited that already sort of done. And then they moved aside thinking that all the scary things that were starting, we're getting all sorts of funny looking films with book pictures on them and that sort of thing, with microforms and whatever else was just not their thing. And a few lasted a little bit longer, and then they started to see what we used to call PCs or computers on desks, and that was terrorizing.
That drove many people out the door.
Oh yeah, I remember talking to an older colleague who was retiring that summer, and she just said, "Pat, I'm just not able to cope with these new computers that are coming in and all that sort of thing." And then we came along, and it was exciting, partly, I think, and I think you and I both agree on this, because of all the stuff that was happening.
Yes, right.
And, we somehow...
access to information, ways of, it's astounding what we can do today.
Yeah.
That if somebody had told us 20 years ago, much less 30, we would have just said, you're nuts. It won't happen.
Yeah. Well, maybe sort of picking up on your comments a few moments ago, there is excitement ahead for the next
very much so,
generation. There's
very
going to be a
much.
lot of change, and they're going to have to, do whatever to move with it. But it may make their careers all the more interesting and exciting.
And what I can see of the younger librarians who are in the profession, They're very bright. They're
You
very
really
talented.
have some fabulous people.
Right, they have
coming
great
in.
recent library school graduates have great technology skills. It's
Yeah.
just amazing what they can do and how much they know. It's going to be, they are not dependent on outside vendors bringing into things. They can, you don't want to get into in-house development, but they can really make a difference in what the libraries are able to do in the near future.
Last year, I was invited, as all alums are, the information school, as it's now
Uh-huh.
called, University of Washington,
Uh-huh.
come over and look at the display of student projects
Uh-huh.
that had been put together during the course of the year. And I went, and I looked around at those things, and I thought they must all have degrees, advanced degrees, no
Mhm.
less, in physics and engineering and
Mhm.
so on. They didn't, but they were just, normal.
It's what they can do.
students. But
It's
the
what they
people
can
coming
do.
into the
Mhm.
field,
Mhm.
and they were doing
Yes, and that-
fabulous things.
And it's so important because our user group is younger and younger.
Mhm.
And for any profession to stay on top of the technology you need is a major challenge.
Mhm. That is probably the way it is going to be from now on. Too.
I suspect you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe on that note, Judith Wright, I should thank you both on
Thank
not
you.
only on my own behalf for being part of this conversation
Mm-hmm.
today, but also on behalf of Frank Hodek, Michelle Wu, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I work on the development of an oral history of
Mhm.
law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf portion of Hein Online. And thank you for participating and being part of this project.
Thank you.